Hey, hi. Welcome everybody to the Going Digital series again. We're meeting again after a while. Today we have a very expert person in the area of cryptocurrency, blockchain, and product development, Gautam Sampathkumar. So Gautam is an MS in Information Systems from Carnegie Mellon University in the US. He has over 20 years of experience and he's worked for some very marquee companies like PayPal, Bloomberg, Alcatel-Lucent, Cisco, and now he's the founder of Indra Development Services and Indra Capital. So he's going to be speaking to us today. Welcome to the Going Digital series, Gautam.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Siddharth, and thank you for the kind introduction.
Great. So let's just jump into the questions for today. We're going to talk about the topic of product development. So digital product development. So what, in your opinion, are the top three essential considerations for building a digital product or software?
Yeah, sure. So my experience spans both SaaS as well as business side as well as enterprise as well as consumer. So I think my answer might straddle. I think both sides of it. So in my mind, I mean, the first consideration is, do you think there is a need? First of all, assess is there a need for the product? If you think there is, then you have a hypothesis that you need to validate. So the way you do this, partially, you can talk to potential customers. You can talk to your user base, kind of figure out if this hypothesis is valid, and they may give you some validation there. However, and you want to do this with spending as little time as and dollars as possible. Once you do that, you need to that's just one part of the equation. Beyond that, you need to run like a have a minimum viable product or an MVP. So you run little experiments or features that you can. Essentially, the idea is how can you validate your hypothesis, but in as little investment as possible. The second thing you should think about is, okay, you've identified a need. Does it fit into a workflow either on the enterprise level or with the consumer? So if they have an existing habit that you can essentially embed yourself into, then that is something that's desirable. So, for example, let's say you're building restaurant software. Ideally, if whatever you're building kind of fits into their point of sale system or something that's the existing workflow for the restaurant owner or the restaurant employees, that would be ideal, right? If you expect them to perhaps download an app, get a mobile app or something, and then just do something additional to what they've not been doing before, then you're going to run into a lot more friction. So you want to kind of try to avoid that if possible. So behavioral change is something you want to try to avoid. If you are, that's not to say you should not do this. I mean, a good example of a product that required a massive behavioral change was, in fact, the iPhone itself. When it first came out, people weren't used to the concept of apps, app store, and so on. So, or at least it was a very small level. In that case, your product needs to be like 10x better than the previous product or the alternative, which of course the iPhone was, and hence they were able to acquire that market share. So that's the second thing you should think about. The third point I would say is, ideally, if you can think about how to reach your users or reach your audience before you even build the product, that would be great. Once you build the product, the traditional approach is, you build a product, then you have a sales team or some kind of strategy. You try to get the word out there, try to get people to download your app and so on. An alternative way to think about this is, figure out once you build this product, where is it that you're going to find your users? So if you can figure out how you're going to growth hack your product, to use the term, then that's like the problem is kind of solved. In a way, this is kind of tied into the second point I made, which is about the workflow. So if you can kind of get yourself into the workflow, and then you have a product that just perhaps shows up during the workflow of your consumer. So Slack is a good example of product that kind of embedded themselves into the employee workflow before they approach the corporate side of it to get sales. So that's like the third point I would make.
Great. That's very fascinating, Gautam. And now, when you're building a product, right, there are a lot of companies today, dozens and hundreds of companies today, which outsource, product development. They call it co-product development. So when you are building a product, what should you outsource and what should you build yourself? And will this answer change depending on what stage of the business we are in?
Yeah, so yeah, this is a problem that I've thought about extremely quite a lot, given that we've been we've been at startup stage as well as raising rounds of funding, and you want to think about this at every point. So I would say the initial stages, especially as a startup, you probably want to look to build everything yourself. So definitely don't outsource the core of your product, because that's essentially what defines you, and you're trying to find product market fit. That's something that cannot be outsourced. This may not be the answer that, let's say, non-technical co-founder might want to hear, but the idea for them is that they have to still be quite technical. Maybe they're not writing code, but at least they should have a technical co-founder or technical team, and they should get into the nuts and bolts of it as much as possible. So they should be more on the side of a technical product manager rather than a product manager who's more on the market side of things, at least in the initial stages of the startup. Now, once you scale up, you can think about outsourcing things that are peripheral to your core system. So, for example, there may be cases where there are other companies that can do things that in a much better way than you could. So, one of the things that comes to mind is like data warehousing or reporting. So, if your core is something else, then you don't want to spend a lot of cycles or investments trying to build those kinds of things. So those you can kind of give an input into those companies and have it outsourced. So either you buy a product, or you outsource it to a vendor who can help you here. So that's when the build versus buy decisions are made, when you have that when you have those types of systems. So that's I would say the answer there. Now this may change as you grow your business. You're gonna have more systems in the periphery, but I still would say the core, which kind of defines what is your competitive advantage versus others, I think that you have to keep it in house. So that's my
Lovely. So now, how does one actually scale a product, right? I mean, there is a build phase for a new product, but then how does one scale the product? What's a good way to go about that?
Yeah, sure. I think we can split this up into essentially two phases, right? We can say there's a build phase where you're trying to define something and build something new, and then there's a phase at which, let's say, you've acquired a lot of users, and now you need to figure out how your product is gonna serve them in terms of capacity, and just maintaining uptime and so on. So, say in initial phases, you need to definitely think more about product market fit, new features that you're building, and focus on quick. For lack of a better term, I would say just quick and dirty features. Just build something quickly, test it, validate it. You may have to throw it away in many cases. So it's very important not to over optimize at this stage. So the idea is don't try to, for example, build a feature that's going to service, let's say, 10x the number of users you have currently, because you might have to throw this feature again anyway, as I mentioned. So just focus on the right thing, right problem at the right time. You are going to get to a stage where you're scaling up, and you have a lot of traffic, perhaps on the back end side of things, or on the or with the consumer. So in that case, you start thinking about other things. You start thinking about the latency, transaction throughput. You start thinking about how your system gets deployed. So you have DevOps angle to this. So you start thinking about using things like Docker and Kubernetes to orchestrate, auto scale, and so on. You have to kind of focus on the right problem at the right time. That's my 2 cents there.
And if one has to distinguish between the roles of product management versus product engineering, right? This is one of the things that a lot of people are confused about. You want to share your expertise and experience in that area?
There are product managers and product engineers. That's definitely a question that comes up quite often. The roles get blurred, especially when you have companies like Google that expect your product manager to be extremely technical. In fact, the distinction becomes even lesser at that point. But for the sake of let's try to define these roles, because there is a distinction. The product managers typically focus more on the business side of things. They have a customer relationship. They're talking to customers, market research, and so on. That kind of falls within the gambit of what they do. A product engineer is essentially, the way I would think about it, is essentially a development engineer or software engineer who's kind of graduated to the next level. So when you're at the lower level, you probably think about more on the lines of coding and code practices, how best to build a system, and so on. And in those cases, you essentially need to be told exactly how to build the product, and you focus just on the technical aspect of it. Well, this is okay for the early stage of a career, right? But then as you grow, you probably want to develop yourself more into a product engineer. So that's the way I would think about product engineering. A product manager typically would be somebody that that does need to be technical, but essentially may just have a vision. It's up to the product engineer to kind of think about things like feasibility. They've been given a feature. They would have to go back to the product manager and tell them about the cost of the feature in terms of hardware, software, because those are things that the product manager may typically not think about. That's the thing. That's my take on this.
Cool. Hey, so thanks for that again, Gautam. So one or two more questions. So how does one leverage things like cloud and the microservices architecture that everybody speaks about nowadays to enhance or expedite one's product development?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll start off by defining first what a microservice is. And it's a very basic definition. I'm not going to go too technical here, but
Sure.
essentially it's just the idea of a very very specialized function being performed by a service that just does one thing and does that one thing really well, right? And it may even scale. So it may do. I'll give you a quick example, right? I used to work for a company that was involved in building an app store. In fact, they were building app stores before Apple was around, but that's perhaps perhaps time for a different story. But the idea is that you have this microservice that essentially takes in it just figures out user agents, right? So it takes in a string and it figures out, okay, this is an iPhone or this is an Android. Now the service had to scale up to hundreds of millions of requests every second. So it does one thing, but then the technical complexity, as you can imagine, is quite large there. But once we were able to build this service could be leveraged across the enterprise, right? So pretty much anyone who wanted to do that particular function would integrate with and interact with this service. So that's that rapidly cuts down development time, allows the team that's building the service to focus on getting this service to be better and better, and really optimize it. So that's an example of cloud services or microservices that really helps in cutting down development time, as well as just increases quality overall.
Got it. And what role is the cloud playing in expediting product development? Is there something that's happening on that side as well?
Yeah, when you look at a service like AWS or DigitalOcean, any of these guys, they've done an extremely good job of like defining services. Like, for example, you can get the MongoDB in the cloud, you can get Elasticsearch in the cloud, and so on. So engineers back in the day, engineers have to worry about every single one of these components and how do I stand up an Elasticsearch cluster, and think about all the technical aspects involved in that. However, with now it's become so simple with AWS. It's almost like a Lego, right? Building blocks. You
Yeah.
just take Elasticsearch, just take MongoDB, put it all together into an application. And the AWS engineers are obviously going to do a really good job of provisioning that service for you. In fact, adding things like auto scaling, so you really can focus on just the business problem that you're trying to solve, and don't have to worry too much about the rest of the infrastructure.
Makes sense. Now, given what's happening in the industry today with so much available, just pick up as a microservice and plug it into your product and microservices architecture and all that. How does one actually build that culture of innovation, in a product team? How does one do that?
Yeah, that's another great question. So innovation is one thing that, first of all, I mean, it's very useful to think of it as it's every member of every team has a say in this. It's not just something that the product owner comes up, and it's not like a top down approach. So it seems like a very obvious thing to say, but you'd be surprised as how many organizations don't follow a very simple approach of encouraging everyone to come and chime in with their ideas. The idea is that you need to encourage experimentation. So you want to try out something and see if you had a certain idea. Does it work out? And again, do it at minimum cost as possible. However, you do want to ask some questions before otherwise you could get into a culture where you're just experimenting with a number of different things, and essentially throwing money in every direction, trying to and hoping that something sticks, right? So that's probably not the best approach. So you want to follow a data driven approach. So when somebody comes to you, let's say you're the CEO, the founder of the company, someone comes to you with an idea, you want to ask them for data, right? What is the data that based on which you came up with your hypothesis? And so if so for instance, someone feels that they want to introduce a certain widget into a workflow, the data that they have might be that users dropped off at 80% rate at a certain point, and for them to introduce the certain widget at that point might help stem the flow of the drop off, right? So that's the kind of data that you want to act on. So you want to encourage innovation, ideas, experimentation, but with a data driven approach. You also want to embrace the concept of fail fast, which is just that try something and then and really, if do everything you can to for it to succeed, but then if it doesn't, then just move on to the next thing. This doesn't mean giving up too quickly, but more along the lines of just optimize it, try it, and then you have to be willing to move on to the next thing, and maybe tweak it until it works out, right? That's the approach that I would take.
Got it. Just one last question. This fail fast, we hear this all the time. How does one decide whether a product is, working, not working, an experiment has worked or not worked? What are those symptoms that one should look for that tell us that, hey, this is not working out, let's move on? How does one decide that?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I mean, there is no perfect answer here, but I mean, the way I tend to think about it is, so just like the scientific, we're talking about the scientific method. Yeah, you have a hypothesis, you have a set of methods you're going to use to validate it. And in turn, you should also define what is it that invalidates hypothesis, right? So, and this may be very simple in many cases. So, for example, in that previous example that I was talking to you about, yeah, if you put the widget in the workflow and it doesn't stem the tide of the users dropping off, then it's in that it's very black and white in that case, and then you just really have to move on to the next experiment. But yeah, the answer does get it is a little bit more of an art than a science as you get along. So I mean, I think work experience I think comes into play here. That's probably what I would say.
Great. Thank you, Gautam. It was a very insightful set of answers you gave on very diverse topics within the area of product management. Thank you so much for your time and your inputs.